From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will talk about long-range grain marketing opportunities showing up now in the current futures market carry. And he'll remark on the impact of computerization on market response to fundamental signals during his weekly segment on the grain market trends. Following Dan, then, K-State's Joe Janzen on the effects of futures market price limits on commodity price movements following significant market news events. That's a topic he spoke on at that Agricultural Commodity Futures Conference co-hosted by K-State last week. And standing by to cover the Kansas agricultural weather scene with us, K-State's Mary Knapp, along with much more here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Grain markets, our first topic in the order today, with Dan O'Brien with us via phone, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Dan is one of those who attended that K-State Commodity Futures Trading Commission Ag Commodity Market Conference a week ago, and we'll get some thoughts from him on what took place there. But first, Dan, to the markets, another week and another muted response, if that, by the markets to planting delays.
Yes, it seems that the market, as it looks at planting prospects and the likelihood or the bet that even though it's wet now, that we'll still be able to get the crops in a timely manner. And given that general mindset, that general approach, we're not seeing a lot of movement to the positive side at all in the grain markets.
In fact, they're in the doldrums, to be quite honest about it.
Doldrums. I thought this was supposed to be done in February, early March. But anyway, it's still hanging around. Again, we're not seeing what we've seen in the past as a typical expression of planting time uncertainty. And I don't want to get us off track, Eric, but in this new era of algorithm-led trading, do we still respond to, quote, worries in the market in the same way that we did before? Again, in some past years, we'd, with forecasts for the next week or so of remaining with quite a bit of moisture. Here we're just past mid-April. I have moisture prospects for the coming weeks heading towards May 1, and some real questions about when the crops will be planted. Now, I would say our friends at the University of Illinois came out with a great series of quick studies in the last year or so about how long in the 3 I states it takes under good weather to get the crops in those states planted. And typically, if you have great weather, you can get the Iowa, Illinois, Indiana corn crop planted in anywhere from 11 to 14, 15 days.
If you have great weather.
If you have the great weather. So what does that say about these issues that we've just spoken about? Well, if optimal planting dates are around May 1st, but yet you still don't lose much through May 15th or thereabouts, you'll probably have to get a week or so down the road without a lot of progress and still worries about drying of soils before you'd see much of a response in the market. Again, the corn plantings as of April 14th, just minimal. 57% of the crop in Texas has been planted, but nothing more than 16, 18% in 18% in North Carolina, 16% in Tennessee, every place else below 10. And nationally, the numbers, we typically be about 5% planted by now. During the 14 through 18 time frame, we're at 3%, but we've got moist soils in a lot of important places and still the likelihood of moisture coming. So with all that, I think a person can become a broken record bemoaning that issue,
right.
But it just does seem to be the issue that will be driving the corn, soybean markets for the next 30 to 60 days. When you do look at corn futures, we had gotten down in the last week and a half, down as low on the May contract as 355, closed yesterday 358 and a half. Within the last couple of weeks, we've been as high as 365. So you're really kind of range bound, and we're just moving a cent or two per day, and actually per week. There's not a lot of change from week to week. And I would go even further to say, if you look back to where the overall lead futures contracts have been running all the way back to, say, January 2011, we have lows about 325 that we periodically hit, but where we're at about right now, if you take out those most extreme lows, we're about there, about 350, 355, 358. That's where we tend to hang out until we just would dive down for a little bit of time below that. So we're just not anticipating in the corn market any of these problems coming about. On the soybean market, we've gotten down, actually on yesterday, it had gotten down to a low just around 875, 876, something like that. Closed yesterday at 880 and a half. Had been trading up around 905, 890, up to as high as 945, 950 back in, again, December of last year. Got up to, again, 950 and have been up and down some, but generally downtrending pretty decidedly since about February the 1st. And again, when we've gotten low, I guess, in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been about something along the lines of 8, 810, 812, something like that. Where we're trading at, as of yesterday's close, at 880 is just about 10, 15 cents above where we tend to have gotten otherwise, absent those extremes. So, again, another situation where we're trading at a pessimistic range. And for wheat, really a similar deal. Yesterday at 420, just marginally above about 410, 412, thereabouts, where we gotten within the last week. And that also is the lowest price we've seen since, in the last 8 months. So a lot of combined pessimism. And I'd say when you look at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission position of traders data, you really see the managed money traders taking out very decidedly bearish sell positions in the market. The net for corn of the managed money, i.e. the spec traders, is record low, at least record low as far as the back I could see to 2006 on the data. When you look at wheat, net position for spec traders in that commodity isn't a record low. The record low came about December 2017, but boy, we're not far off of it. So that's pretty pessimistic. On the soybean market, since 2017, several times we've been a little more pessimistic than where we're even at right now. But the hymn book that we're singing out of right now is pessimism in the markets.
No.
You'd have to have a change in the market's overall paradigm of generally large crops coming and poor exports, poor trade, all mixed in. And those things can change, but until there's actual evidence of it, and given the algorithmic approach that so many of our trading interests are using, we'll have to have real evidence to really break out of this current situation that we're in, it seems to me anyway.
Well, Dan, we're clearly scraping and scratching for anything positive out of these markets, and you think there might be a little something here as far as marketing signals in the current futures market carry.
Yeah, we're so focused on these upfront contracts. That's what you and I have been talking about all the way through here. If you look at corn futures, May corns yesterday closed at 358.5. If you look out to May 2020, it's 408. 50 cents higher. Soybeans, again, May of 2020, 938. Another 50-some cents higher, 58 cents. Wheat, of course, May right now is 420. The lead contract, May 2020, is up to 490, 70 cents. So in talking with a number of traders, it was interesting to hear their thoughts about how they look out to the future and look at the carrying charges and look at contracts that don't have a lot of volume in them right now, but yet and look at just with the carries we have in these markets, what type of pricing opportunities they have. Gosh, it at least merits some attention to 50, 70, 80 cents that a person could take advantage of. You'd have to take a position in those markets as producers. We'd be hedging or forward contracting. But there are some price opportunities out there. They're just not right now. They're about a year down the road. Yeah. And how do we think differently about that? We're not used to taking positions that far out, but yet, as we're sitting here today, that's where the money's at, that far out, given the assumptions in the market on carry.
Right. You've got to weigh your risk when you consider those things to be certain.
Sure.
Now, in a few moments, we will hear from one of the presenters out of the Agricultural Economics Department here at K-State at that Agricultural Commodity Futures Conference that K-State co-hosted with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission this past week in Overland Park. You were in attendance. What captivated your attention there, Dan?
I guess the thing that came to mind for me was in hearing the discussions about how algorithmic trading has affected the functions of the market, and even hearing calls of people saying we still need humans involved, that number one, I need to understand what signals these algorithmic mechanisms are paying attention to, and are they only looking at USDA reports, or are they looking at other information that comes along? If they're focused on USDA reports, then that would indicate that our times of volatility are all that much more concentrated around when the USDA gives us WASDE, crop production, acreage, and whatever reports. Now, I'm sure that people that design those algorithms aren't looking only at that, but without question, those are important times. So if those times are what's moving the markets, that's when we need to be paying attention to both ahead of and immediately afterwards to see just what we need to do to take advantage of or protect ourselves from anything that could happen as a result of any change in direction in the market and the resulting price moves. I think overall, it just reminds me that it's easy to predict on the trend. It's difficult to determine when the trend's going to change. And that's the issue that I wonder on with regard to the influence of algorithmic trading right now.
We always appreciate your input, and we'll talk again next Friday. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien with us, as he is each week right here, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. And we will return after this. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Next up for you on this Agriculture Today, highlights from a presentation that was made at a special conference last week in Overland Park, and it featured the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in collaboration with Kansas State University's Center for Risk Management, Education and Research, and this amounts to a commodity futures conference focusing on agricultural markets, of course. A great number of folks were there presenting information on a wide swath of topics, including our guest now, agricultural economist Joe Janzen of Kansas State University. His specialty is in the agricultural commodity markets. And before we dive into the information that you were sharing, Joe, describe this conference, if you would, for the lay folk out there.
So the conference is an opportunity for the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is the main regulator of our agricultural commodity futures markets. They wanted an opportunity to be able to hear from people who use these markets every day. And those people, by and large, in agriculture are located in the middle of the country. So they thought it would be a good idea to come to Kansas. And they partnered with Kansas State University to really provide a forum for academics, people on the regulatory side of this, and then also, and most importantly, participants, so people who are in the business of buying and selling commodities and using commodity futures to manage price risk, for those people to have a forum to air concerns that they have about how these markets operate, and to see if we can sort of dialogue on how to improve the function and efficiency of our futures markets.
Now, we'll only touch upon one of the topics, the one that you presented on, but presumably that dialogue was rather vigorous throughout the couple of days there. Right?
Absolutely. And it really it's a discussion among people who know these markets pretty well, and we really do get an opportunity to kind of dive down into the weeds a little bit and to really dig deep on some pretty specific issues. For example, how buy and sell orders are matched in a futures market. We talked about this. We talked about sort of how do markets behave around the release of USDA reports. And then there was a session that I spoke in which talked about how markets behave when we have sort of unanticipated news events. So we get something like BSE hitting the cattle market. And if we remember back to 2003, that's a little bit of distant history at this point. But you can remember that live cattle prices fell very, very fast. And there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty and volatility in the market. And in that situation, we don't want sort of the rules of the game to be inhibiting the function of the market and the process by which we establish prices, because we want to know, everyone wants to know, okay, how does this change? We know that something like that, like say a BSE, is going to change what prices are going to be, but we want to know, like, are we getting the right number, essentially? Are we getting the right prices when supply and demand changes?
So you lent input in your presentation again on these price limits as a mechanism in the commodity markets as a response to these significant news events. What limits are, in fact, in place in the futures trades to this extent?
So the basic idea behind price limits is that there may be situations where the market's moving too far too fast. And the market needs to take a pause to sort of either to reevaluate information or just for traders to sort of know how they want to position themselves in response to this news. So the two main mechanisms by which we do that, we have daily price limits. So the market can only move by so many cents per bushel or cents per pound on a given day. And if the market reaches that limit, no trade can occur at a price that sort of exceeds that limit, up or down. So we have those daily price limits. Then we also have shorter run trading halts where if the market moves too fast, say inside even a second or a sub-second period of time, trading will stop, say, for 5 or 10 seconds to allow market participants to sort of reevaluate things, for liquidity to come back into that market, for traders to come back in and say, okay, I'm willing to buy and sell or sell at a particular price. So, and we've actually seen this a fair bit relatively recently, these sort of intraday, inside the day price limits kicking in especially in the hog market. Obviously, we've had a lot of volatility in the hog market, but what will happen is a big trade will come into that market. It'll move the price. The threshold, I think, is about a cent per pound. So if we see a cent per pound move inside a very short window of time, the market can reevaluate. And oftentimes what that allows the market to do is sort of everyone to say, well, the price didn't really need to move that much in that really short window of time. Let's let sort of the liquidity replenish on one side of the market, and we move on after that sort of short pause.
Well, Joe, what you did, you took up the costs and the benefits of implementing these price limits and eventually how prices would be affected over the long pull, correct?
Yeah. We want to think about, right, sort of why these limits exist and then if they impose some costs. And so the big cost being, the most obvious cost being when the market is prevented from trading because a limit is hit, we have a certain level of uncertainty about what the real price is. So if we see a limit move in cattle and prices fall by 3 cents per pound, right? Well, conceivably, if we had let trade continue, they would have fallen more than 3 cents a pound, but we don't know how much more because the market just isn't allowed to trade at prices outside of that band within a given day. And so there's sort of this loss of price discovery that occurs. But on the other hand, if that move is sort of, in some sense, an overreaction to the news or caused by traders just trying to get out of the market because they sort of don't want to trade in a period where things are really volatile, or they're worried about margin calls and sort of meeting the margin requirements that our markets impose, then there could be some benefits to imposing a limit. And so we tried to evaluate that sort of this idea that, are these price moves potentially overreactions? And what we find is that in general, we certainly see there are times when the markets might sort of come back off of that limit, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the price was an overreaction. And so there's definitely sort of a cost to imposing these limits. And the cost is higher when we impose them more often. And so if you compare the cattle side and the grain side, we see very different performance in terms of how often those limits bind. So on the grain side, we might see a limit move, especially recently in the last few years, we've seen maybe just a handful of limit move days in wheat and corn and soybeans, particularly in wheat and corn. On the cattle side, we see limit price moves all the time because the limits are just set a lot tighter. So one thing that we talked about at the conference was, maybe it's a good idea to have some adjustability in how these limits are imposed. And the question is, well, do we want to sort of leave that up to the CME and say, whenever you guys think it's a good idea, maybe you should change the limit? Or whenever sort of market participants complain loudly enough, maybe we should change the limit? Or do we want to build in a mechanism to make those limits more adjustable? And since 2014 on the grain side, we've had that ability where the limits are more adjustable. So basically, when prices go up, the limits are set as a percentage of the price within sort of rounding off to a 5 cent increment, but set as a percentage of the price. On the cattle side, we haven't changed the limits in 15, 16 years. So in that case, right, now we get to a situation where the limits bind all the time, and we have sort of this loss of price discovery and this period of uncertainty when we have a limit move. And I think a lot of people trading these markets would say that is potentially a significant cost to them in using these markets, and we want to think about a way to make the policy, make the rules flexible to react to the market conditions as they exist.
Well, Joe, you say that on the grain side, limit adjustments have been in place for a few years as opposed to the livestock side. Mm-hmm. Has anything been learned about the effectiveness of that approach that might be more applicable across the board going down the road?
So we tried to study this period of variable price limits to see sort of if we make those limits tighter, and that's what we've seen, right? We've seen that limits are sort of tighter or looser depending on, what period of time we are, because we've had sort of changes in the limits. That allows us to sort of analyze the effect of tightening limits. And so me and a grad student of mine here at K-State did a short analysis where we tried to look at this idea that if the limits get tighter, do they increase the probability that limits hit? And in fact, they don't necessarily do that because now the market mechanism is more responsive. And so it's not simply the case that tightening the limits will sort of reduce volatility. We don't see that. We don't see that occurring. So I think it's tempting to say, if we allow wider limits, that we'll get more volatility, and we don't necessarily see that. I think that the limits are a reaction to the volatility and not the other way around.
Now, the purpose of your presentation wasn't to come to definitive decisions, right? Simply to lay all of this out there for CFTC officials and others, including market participants, to contemplate this.
Absolutely. I think it's helpful to have a robust discussion about how we set the rules of the game and to sort of consider the trade-offs for different participants. Then that's what we did. Ultimately, I think the goal of this conference is, again, to provide a forum for both the CFTC as the regulator and the exchanges who are tasked with operating these markets to get the broadest sense of sort of opinions among market participants. Because ultimately, these markets exist for the participants and for the public at large who use the prices, even if they don't sort of trade directly in this market, right? You use the prices that are set in these markets as a signal. And so we want to make sure that everyone's voice is heard, and that we set the rules of the game in a way that's the most fair to the most people.
Joe, thanks for summarizing this. Hope to have you back soon and talk about other aspects of the markets, but we do appreciate your time right here.
Thank you, Eric.
He is Joe Janzen, agricultural economist here at Kansas State. One of the presenters at that Kansas State University Commodity Futures Trading Commission Agricultural Commodity Futures Conference this past week in Overland Park, Kansas. And Joe shared information on the causes and the consequences of price limits as a response to significant news events that might impact the commodity trades. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll be back on the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And for you now, today's agricultural news headlines in brief, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, following a ruling back in February favoring the United States in a dispute over Chinese grain domestic supports, the World Trade Organization has sided with the U.S. again in a similar case. Here's the latest on that from the USDA's Rod Bain.
At February's end, the U.S. won a significant victory at the World Trade Organization in its dispute with China over its domestic supports of wheat, corn, and rice, limiting U.S. export of those commodities in that market. As U.S. Trade Representative Chief Ag Negotiator Greg Dowd said days before that WTO dispute settlement panel ruling,
when it comes to wheat, rice, and corn, we think China has exceeded what it was allowed to do when it became a member of the WTO by somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 billion.
And on Thursday, a second WTO panel ruling found China has administered its tariff rate quotas for wheat, corn, and rice inconsistently with its World Trade Organization commitments, and in turn denying U.S. export access. A joint USTR-USDA press release on the ruling uses the example that if China fully used its tariff rate quota in 2015, U.S. exports of wheat, corn, and rice for that year would have been as much as $3.5 billion with a B dollars to that market. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Meantime, top trade officials from the U.S. and Japan concluded 2 days of talks in Washington this week, officials indicating the discussions focused mainly on goods and some services. The U.S. and Japan discussed trade issues involving agricultural products as well, along with the need to establish high standards in the area of digital trade. That, according to the U.S. Office of Trade Representative. In a statement, U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer and Japan's Economic Revitalization Minister Toshimitsu Motegi held those discussions. The trade representative saying the U.S. raised its very large trade deficit with Japan, $76.5 billion in goods in 2018. Lighthizer and Motegi agreed to meet again in the near future to continue these talks, with Reuters reporting that the talks would take place this next week ahead of a session between Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and President Trump. Japan's Motegi told reporters that he hoped to reach good results in the talks at a very early stage. And this month's USDA Cattle on Feed report pretty much comes in line with analysts' expectations. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
The number of cattle on feed in the country is up both month to month and year to year.
If we look at the number of cattle on feed and feedlots with a capacity of 1,000 head or greater on April 1st, we had just under 12 million head, which was about 2% above a year ago. During March, 2 million head of cattle were placed on feed, which was 5% above a year ago. Feedlots marketed 1.8 million head of cattle, which was down 3% from a year ago.
That was USDA livestock analyst Shail Shagam, who says this month's numbers are in line with analyst expectations.
Now, the other information that we would get from the cattle on feed report this month would be the number of heifers and heifer calves on feed on April 1st.
He says there is a higher percentage of female cows on feed this year compared to last year.
The fact that there is this higher percentage of heifers in feedlots can be a sign that the producers are putting them in the feed, have put them in the feedlots, as opposed to keeping them back for addition to breeding herds.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Incidentally, Kansas feedlots with capacities of 1,000 or more head held 2.38 million cattle on feed as of April the 1st. That inventory up 2% from the same time last year. Placements during March at 470,000 head, up 16% from 2018 in March. And fed cattle marketings for the month totaling 375,000 head, down 6% from last year. The Kansas wheat industry recently hosted a group of wheat customers from 2 Middle East countries for an informational tour. These buyers were able to become better acquainted with several aspects of wheat production, marketing, and usage. Jordan Hildebrand recaps their experience on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Jordan?
Wheat buyers from Morocco and Tunisia got an up-close look at the intricacies and reliability of the U.S. grain infrastructure during the April 12th through 19th Cochrane Fellowship Program's experience in Kansas and Texas. Morocco and Tunisia are part of the Middle East and North Africa, MENA, region, which has the largest volume of wheat imports from all origins. While market share in the MENA region has fallen, there are several expanding in-use market segments that hold promise for U.S. wheat. These niche products include specialty artisan and frozen doughs and premixes, pasta from non-durum flour, and growing biscuit, cracker, and confectionery products. These products need the high or low protein, depending on the product, with the high-quality traits that American wheat is known for. Aaron Harris, Vice President of Research and Operations for Kansas Wheat, said, "While it's unfortunate that U.S. market share in the MENA region has dropped due to increased competition, there are some real opportunities for us in those specialty products. The U.S. wheat industry has to remain visible to those buyers in order to capitalize on those emerging opportunities, and bringing the Cochrane Fellows to Kansas is a great way to do that." Kansas was the first leg for the Cochrane Fellows team. During their first day in the state, the participants visited the research space at the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center, received an overview of the U.S. grain handling infrastructure and grain quality assessment at the IGP Institute, toured the Kansas State University Hal Ross Flour Mill and the O.H. Cruz Feed Mill, and ended their day at the Andreas Farm near Junction City. The next day, participants visited the Cargill Shuttle Train Loader near Topeka and the Federal Grain Inspection Service Technical Center in Kansas City, Missouri. Morocco and Tunisia's subregion relies heavily on grain imports, with bread and durum wheat as the most prominent imported cereals. These countries imported 17.35 million metric tons of wheat from all origins in marketing year 16 and 17, and 1.6 million metric tons of U.S. wheat in marketing year 16-17, 85% of which was hard red winter, and 14.3% was durum. Morocco does buy smaller quantities of hard red spring, but mostly relies on hard red winter wheat to fill the shortage of domestic or EU production. Tunisia mostly buys U.S. durum. Team participants also visited Houston, Texas. While there, the Cochrane Fellows experienced Port Houston up close and personal with a Sam Houston boat tour along the Houston Ship Canal. This unique opportunity helped buyers visualize international cargo vessels and operation at the port's turning basin terminal. Next, the Cochrane Fellows visited the Lansing terminal to get a full-fledged field-to-vessel look at the country's wheat industry. Harry said, "The members of this group of Cochrane Fellows were engaged and excited about the U.S. wheat industry. It's experiences like these that help to build or solidify trading relationships with our export market." For Kansas Wheat, this is Jordan Hildebrand.
Thanks, Jordan. Your latest Kansas agricultural weather outlook is next on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Now for you on Agriculture Today, Kansas agricultural weather and the latest update from Mary Knapp, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension. Mary, we've settled into what most would consider typical spring weather now, and as we look back on this past week, substantial rainfall in southeast Kansas. However, elsewhere, not much, you say.
Right. We saw, again, well over an inch in many places in southeastern Kansas, but you didn't have to go very far north of the 35 line to just basically have seen the clouds and not seen much of the moisture at all, a couple hundredths of an inch in places. If we look at it, the average for the week was much drier than normal for all except the southeast. That was offset very much by the temperatures, because our temperatures were running cooler than normal, and the coolest area was the northwest, where they were still recovering, if you will, from that last blast of winter where they had their blizzard conditions. Not a whole lot of snow with that, and not a whole lot of moisture, but most of it was going sideways, and again, very cold temperatures in that region.
Just to stress, though, at no location in the state are we tempting drought conditions yet, are we?
No, we are not. It has been more favorably dry. We have actually dried out enough that people have been able to get into the field. There still are reports from producers where they've attempted to get stuff done, and it may be dry on the uplands, but when you get down into the valley a little bit, they've had to go around areas and not even get in there. Still reports of applicators that have gotten stuck in mud holes. So there's a dry crust on the surface, but there is substantial moisture in the subsoil across the state. So we can hold out a little bit longer without a lot of rain and still be okay.
Well, how are soil temperatures faring then? Have they been rather stable in recent days?
They have been rather stable. It was really interesting to see in the western areas where we did get down to 19 degrees for our air temperature, a lot of cold, again, snow up in the northwest. Those soil temperatures are still hovering in the upper 40s, so they didn't lose ground as much, which is to be expected with the wet soils. They're slower to turn temperatures. But we haven't warmed up a whole lot either. We're looking at some places in the central and eastern areas where we're in the mid-50s. But again, it's been slow to warm up due to the fact that those soils are saturated. And of course, if you've got a field that you've got a lot of residue on, those will be slower to warm up even more than it might be otherwise.
And just as a sidebar, you've been interacting with your colleagues in the Department of Agronomy, and they're encouraging producers to be patient on their planting in accordance with those soil temperatures.
Right, particularly when you're talking corn, because corn can be very poorly affected or badly affected, however you want to say it, with those cold, wet soils. And those impacts can linger throughout the season. One of the biggest factors is that it can interfere with the rooting process, and then you don't have those roots to sustain the corn later on in the season. I can guarantee that we'll have times when you'll need that root system to access the moisture, and if you haven't had a well-established plant, that's going to create problems down the road. In fact, there are some producers that are talking about planting their soybeans and waiting a while for planting their corn, trying to get their field work accomplished. They've shifted to, let's get those soybeans in the ground and then we'll follow up with the corn. One of the thoughts in that would be that they could avoid that spike in temperatures that sometimes comes in late June and move the pollination period a little bit out of that and not have those highest temperatures when they're trying to get their corn through the pollinating area. That's kind of a hit and miss thing because your high temperatures could be any time, and if you get that right when you're at the most vulnerable stage, there's not much you can do about it. But that is one thing that they're looking at, and there are a number of attempts to evaluate that and see how well that will hold.
Incidentally, there will be information on all of that coming out in the latest Agronomy e-Update newsletter later today, agronomy.ksu.edu. So looking ahead, the weekend appears to be rather pleasant with a chance for moisture rolling in latter part of the weekend?
It looks like the latter part of the weekend, and then as we go into next week, we have a number of chances where systems are going to be coming through and they may produce rain. If we look at the quantitative precip forecast for the week ending next Thursday, the totals over that time period are, again, fairly substantial. We're looking at upwards of 2 inches in the southeast. That drops off as you move north and west, but even in the northwest corner where it's expected to be driest, they're looking at between 1/4 and 1/2 inch of rain. That will be welcome. It won't necessarily be as much as you would normally see in a week's period, but it will certainly give a beneficial amount, particularly to the winter wheat, which is really growing actively now that we've gotten some more moderate temperatures. The amount of wheat that has jointed is fairly limited. It's just beginning to move into that phase, so it's a little bit later than we've seen for the last several seasons.
But it's doing relatively well. And as you look ahead, 6 to 10, 8 to 14-day outlooks, what are those suggesting?
Well, at this point, what they're suggesting is that we're going to have some milder temperatures. They're actually calling for warmer than normal temperatures for both of those periods. But they're also calling for an increased chance for wetter than normal conditions across the state. So if we get those warmer temperatures, it looks like it may also be accompanied by some rainfall. Again, we don't necessarily need wetter than normal, but we certainly could use a round of moisture, particularly for those fall-planted crops that are beginning to move into that vegetative phase. And we're talking, again, the winter wheat and the canola in particular.
Right, but sounds as if one should get one's field work done whenever the opportunity presents itself.
Right, and again, be cautious because there is still ample moisture in the subsoils, and compaction is always a concern.
Yeah, use good discretion there. Mary, thanks, and once again, enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp with us, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. And thanks to you likewise for tuning in. A happy Easter to you and yours. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.